I'm going to keep these introductory remarks quite brief. I just wanted to explain a little bit about the theme of the event and the rationale for holding it. The title references changes unseen in a century, which is an expression that's often been used by Chinese President Xi Jinping over the course of the last 5 years to describe the global political shift that's taking place. What does changes unseen in a century mean? And what were the big changes that happened a century ago? Well, what happened a century ago in 1970 is that a revolution took place in Russia, which was the start of humanity's transition from the era of capitalism to the era of socialism. The October Revolution led to the formation of the Soviet Union, which contributed to the building of socialism in China, in Cuba, in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Nicaragua, and the people's democracies of Eastern Europe. And it also gave an important impetus to the anti-colonial movement and the national liberation struggles around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. It was the first major breach in the imperialist world system, and it hastened the demise of colonialism. It changed the world forever. Of course, a lot has happened in the intervening period, and not all of it has been good. A lot of countries won their liberation, but the Soviet Union and many other socialist countries don't exist anymore. And we've witnessed the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of neo-colonialism, and we've lived through the supposed end of history. But times are changing once again, and these are the changes unseen in the century. The so-called post-war rules-based international order, that is US hegemony, is breaking down, and the end of history narrative just isn't convincing anymore. Neoliberalism has run out of road. The countries of the global south are rising. China is stronger than it's ever been. Iran is stronger than it's ever been. Several countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have thrown off their neo-colonial shackles and are pursuing sovereign development and explicitly aligning themselves with forces of resistance worldwide. Africa is recovering from the period of structural adjustment and moving towards unity and development. BRICS is becoming increasingly important and has even overtaken the G7 in terms of population size, economic size, and global influence. The US and its allies can no longer impose their will on the world. They pummeled Afghanistan for 20 years and ended up handing it back to the very same forces that they claimed to be going after in the first place. They pursued regime change in Syria for 13 years without success. They bombed Iraq into the Stone Age. They bombed Libya into the Stone Age. They've enthusiastically participated in the genocidal assault on Yemen. But can anyone reasonably say that the West won any of these wars at a time when the Yemenis are making it extremely difficult for Western ships and aircraft carriers to traverse the Red Sea? They've tried to sanction and starve Iran into submission, but Iran is still standing. And what's more, has shown that it's capable of responding to Israeli aggression with hundreds of drones directed at Israeli military facilities. They thought their sanctions on Russia would bring the Russian economy to its knees and that NATO would score a massive victory in Ukraine. 2 years later, Russia's economy is growing significantly faster than any G7 country because nearly every country outside the Euro-American imperialist bloc has refused to join in with these illegal unilateral sanctions. They've tried to sanction Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Russia, Eritrea, Korea, Syria, Belarus, and many other countries into submission, but those countries will not be bowed. So this is the context in which the Gaza war has to be situated, a context of a declining US-led empire and a rising multipolarity, a rising global south. And that context, it impacts the events in Palestine, and of course, the events in Palestine are in turn impacting the overall geopolitical situation. The events of October 7th and the ensuing war are changing the world. They're truly earth-shaking. Israel is isolated as never before. Even Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia have recognized Palestine as a state. Even the International Court of Justice has essentially recognized that what's going on in Gaza is a genocide, thanks to the wonderful work being done by South Africa, now being joined by an increasing number of countries. And as Israel is isolated, so are its allies, its backers, the countries that arm it, the countries that provide it with diplomatic cover, of which the US and Britain are the principal culprits. Here in Britain, Israel's genocide has the tacit support of both major parties. Labour leader Keir Starmer refuses to call it a genocide, saying that the evidentiary bar for genocide is very high. Never mind the fact that he accuses China and Russia of engaging in genocide in spite of the total lack of evidence. These countries are isolated on the world stage, as the countries of the developing world are united in their solidarity with Palestine. And these reactionary ruling classes are increasingly isolated at home. Ideological hegemony is breaking down because people can see what's happening in Gaza. They can see there's a genocide. They support Palestinians' right to self-determination. They support Palestinians' right to fight for that self-determination, a right which is enshrined in international law. And the discrepancy between what people understand and what they know, what they feel on one hand, and what the mainstream media and politicians are trying to feed them is bigger than it's ever been. It's starting millions of people are starting to question the whole system of capitalism and imperialism in a way that would have seemed unimaginable not so long ago. So the war in Gaza is uniting the forces of the global South, increasingly bringing in the more progressive forces in the imperialist countries into that alliance as well. As Hugo Chavez put it, it's uniting all the forces that can be united in a common struggle. So the heroic Palestinian people are fighting for all of us. They're in the vanguard of the struggle for a better world. They're living through unbearably difficult times and are facing the most ruthless, the most callous, the most evil aggression. But every single person that dies will be honored as a martyr in the struggle for a free Palestine and indeed a world free from imperialism, hegemonism, and oppression. So with those opening remarks out the way, I'm going to ask our panelists to contribute in order. First up is Sarah Flounders. Sarah is a long-standing political activist and author based in New York City. She is contributing editor of Workers' World newspaper and a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition, the International Action Center, and the Sanctions Kill campaign. She is the co-author and editor of numerous books, most recently, Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in the Global Economy. Sarah Flounders, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for today's very challenging webinar, Changes Unseen in a Century. I love the title because it challenges us to really think about a global shift. I think, although it's changes not seen ever, this is new. Let's look at the changes in science and technology, or the change brought by instant communication that has provided a shattering awareness of a wider world and the possibilities and choices that are available if the old bonds can be broken. For almost all past human history, the great majority of the human population, except for the rulers, had no concept of the world past their own village or across the river. The world now is intensely connected, and that has changed consciousness. There's a global earthquake in the potential of the formerly colonized world to develop with new allies, especially China. The Belt and Road infrastructure projects give a way toward development without the chains of IMF, World Bank debt. And the BRICS Plus gives a whole different look to the world. There's now hope to the 40 sanctioned countries that they can break out of their strangling US-imposed isolation. There's changes in the class struggle and in the potential of millions to grasp that it does not have to be this way. This means changes in morale, in the political mood, and I want to deal with that first, the mood. Imperialism today, as every ruling class in history, can only survive as long as it can demoralize and divide its opponents. It uses sheer terror, horrific examples of their power and dominance, and the ability to convince millions that there is no alternative. So let's look at Palestine today. The Zionists and their imperialist backers and collaborators couldn't imagine that they wouldn't be able to overwhelm and totally destroy the Palestinian movement if they used enough death, hunger, isolation, sheer unpredictable terror. Of course, the Zionists would prevail. They had the world's most powerful backer, the most horrific weapons, so they could ignore the UN and court rulings and mass public opinion. But in 9 months, the Zionists have failed to achieve any of their objectives. The resistance leadership and units remained intact despite inconceivable destruction. How is it possible to hold out? 2 million people versus a monstrous Zionist war machine backed by the US colossus. In Gaza, the struggle is deeply rooted in the people who have no choice but to resist. It's meshed with revolutionary determination and with science and technology, with engineering skills, secret infrastructure. It's even harnessed it to the internet. By video, every hit, every strike is broadcast almost instantaneously to the world. This is new. And it's not individual attacks. It is an incredible mobilization of the whole people. It's a struggle that takes iron discipline and a high level of organization. Tunnels that are 10 times even longer and more complex than those used in Vietnam. There was an article in the Jerusalem Post, the Zionist media, saying we can't win in Gaza because we have no weapons designed for this kind of warfare. Their Iron Dome is their tunnels. Although besieged and walled off, the Palestinian resistance has developed the incredible skill to repurpose Israeli bombs and missiles. 15% of those Israeli missiles are duds. They are repurposed into thousands of shoulder rockets, booby traps for continual ambushes. So nowhere is safe. Then the resistance displays their workshops on video. It takes incredible skill, it takes engineering, it takes chemistry, and it takes organization and discipline and coalitions that respect the many cultural, political currents and religious diversity of Gaza and of all of Palestine. Now, Western media only uses the term Hamas terrorists. They don't dare to describe a diversity of political and religious groups and militias who are able to cooperate and plan operations. Nor can they admit that this is a unity forged in their horrendous prisons, a unity forged in fire. Consider also the incredible solidarity actions of Ansarallah in Yemen. Creative, bold beyond belief, they have been able to continue and expand their shutdown of Israeli ports until there's a ceasefire, they say. And it's now beyond the Red Sea, into the Mediterranean. US aircraft carriers and jets have bombed Yemen and failed to stop the attacks. There are giant mobilizations of millions in Yemen that continue week after week in public. Ansarallah has now developed hypersonic rockets. The USS Eisenhower, a giant aircraft carrier, took it seriously enough to pull back out of range. Who could have imagined that Israeli ports could be blockaded? Global shipping feels the impact, and it's biting deep into the Israeli economy. The Israeli economy is in shambles. Now, let's look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. Greater and greater expertise they have used to take down the Iron Dome, literally take it apart, and driven Israeli settlers out of the north. This week, Israel announced they were going to move on Lebanon. They arrayed the tanks, the trucks, the planes, the weapons. They had the US backing. The Biden administration, in a White House meeting with Israeli officials, actually announced their full support. But 2 days after this June 20th meeting, 2 days after the White House stamp of approval, Hezbollah released a 9-minute video to the world titled, "To Whom It May Concern." And it was footage of a little drone, a drone named after a little bird, the Hoopoe drone, that was able to fly at such low altitude that it evades Israeli radar. Now, this public video included the exact pinpoint coordinates of strategic Israeli facilities, the Iron Dome batteries, the David Sling defenses, the Diamora nuclear reactor, and the critical electrical infrastructure that can paralyze entire cities. 2 days after that video, the world moves fast. June 24th, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Brown, an Air Force general, in a national press conference said there would be no U.S. support if Israel opened war with Hezbollah. What a stunning reversal. It's revolutionary determination using science, technology, and locally sourced material to a new level. So the world is changing in huge ways. There's a massive outpouring of the most militant solidarity across the world. It's without comparison. The confrontations, the encampments, the massive actions in the whole world, the shutdowns, and legislation, arrests, and threats, funding cuts have failed to shut this movement down. It's grown in ways we couldn't have imagined, and so quickly. I'll conclude my remarks because we could speak so much about Palestine, so the change it's made. But let me conclude with China. China and its economy, its productive capacity, its diplomatic approach. The BRICS Plus exceeds US and G7 economy. And this is not a new empire. All of China's major industries, oil, gas, raw materials, high-speed rail, electricity, the infrastructure, are all publicly owned. They're not driven to make a profit every quarter in order to survive. Capitalism is a system where every and any industry can only survive as long as it makes a profit for its shareholders. In China, all the essential industries are owned not by a tiny handful of billionaires. Now, this is a change. And it's directed by a communist party that is millions, tens of millions strong. Industries are liberated to find solutions, even to the most essential global problems. The opening of trade relations, the developing of development plans, building infrastructure, is vastly expanding the size of the working class globally and its productive capacity. This is a change not seen in 100 years, a change never seen. So there are big challenges ahead. I'll close next week. There's a NATO War Summit in Washington, the 75th anniversary of the US commanded organization that was created to be a weapon against the working class in Europe, a weapon to block the threat of socialism. Expanding NATO is taking on the world. They're not succeeding in Russia, that's for sure. That one down. The US plan, though, is for war. They're not dissuaded by this. It's a deadly threat, but it's a challenge that the great majority of humanity stands against them and is refusing to back down. So we should be confident. We should continue to defend every source, every form of resistance that revolutionaries around the world are developing. It's a new day. Embrace the changes. The old world is dying.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those profound and important and very inspiring remarks. The next speaker is due to be Professor Marandi, who I see is here. Professor Marandi, are you willing and able to speak now, or would you rather wait a few minutes?
I can speak now.
Okay. And I will just correct a problem with your Zoom name. Okay. Thank you. That's great. Okay. So our next speaker is Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi. He's someone who would be very well known, I believe, to most of you. He's a professor at the University of Tehran and a widely respected political commentator, regularly appearing on international media, both friendly and hostile, and a perennial cause of distress to people like Piers Morgan. Professor Marandi, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I find it difficult to say much because I know that my colleagues are all very aware of what is going on in the world today, what is going on in our region, and what is going on in East Asia as well as in Europe in particular during these very troubling times. But it is important to keep in mind that as the world changes, new opportunities are being created for better understanding. When I began working with media in my spare time, possibly a big mistake, but I found that the most basic things were up for debate. And the country which I reside in, Iran, was assumed to be the manifestation of evil. And anything that I would say would be seen as regime propaganda, or I would be seen as apologetic for a dying and brutal regime. So it was very difficult during those early years. And sadly, even people who were critical of Western policy, the United States, government, and NATO, they too found it very difficult to accept a lot of what I would say. In fact, when I would sometimes have the opportunity to invite colleagues to Iran to visit, they would be shocked. They would be surprised as to how different it was from the narratives that they had been embedded in. But once they'd get back after a few months, they would go back to the same old narratives. That's how powerful the latent knowledge of Iran was, and continues to be, though in a more fragmented and nuanced form. But things are changing in that now peoples across the world are seeing through the propaganda. The skepticism towards Western narratives has created opportunities for people across Asia, across Africa, across the world to better understand one another. And as those narratives weaken and better understanding emerges, new opportunities for a better future, in my opinion, become more visible. The United States and its regional allies for decades antagonized the resistance at multiple levels. In the case of Iran, Iran was a barbaric, backward country that was hanging gays on the streets every morning, I suppose at 6 a.m. Then at 7 a.m. they were hanging women, and then at 8 a.m. they were probably hanging a group of people. In the region, the state-owned media of oil-rich Arab dictatorships linked to the West would antagonize Iran, would use racist language about Persians, sectarian language about the Shia. But all of this was a combined narrative to demonize resistance, because it was Iran that was supporting the resistance in Palestine, just as it was supporting the resistance in South Africa, just as it was supporting Cuba and Venezuela during the tough times of Western oppression and Western domination. For 2 decades, especially the last 2 decades, Gaza has been preparing itself for today. And so has, over the last decade, Yemen, and for more than 2 decades, Lebanon, and the resistance in Iraq and Syria. And the collective resistance today has shown that it is able to change the balance of power in West Asia to the detriment of colonization, to the detriment of racism and ethno-supremacism. But what I find even more gratifying is the fact that the resistance has moved beyond the region. It includes young Jews in the United States who are standing up against the narrative of the imperial power in Washington. It includes young Europeans, Christians, secular, Hindus, Muslims, and of course, Jews, all of whom are standing up against the powers that have been crushing so much of the world for decades. And that imperialism and that colonialism today manifests itself in the struggle between the Palestinians in Gaza and the ethno-supremacist regime in Tel Aviv. So while the resistance, the axis of resistance, grows in power and gradually surrounds the Israeli regime, at the same time, we see a cultural shift where people better understand one another. Iran finds new allies across the world who until yesterday viewed Iran through the narratives of the West. Iranians view allies across the world with better understanding. And this shift and this change, whether it's the Orthodox Church, whether it's the Jews of New York, or whether it is the Hindu students that were sitting side by side with their Muslim and Christian and Jewish sisters and brothers on campuses. All of these are creating a new environment for us to be able to build collectively a better future. I'm not a person who believes in utopias, but I do believe that the only way to create a better world is if our understanding of one another, our collective understanding of one another, becomes more realistic. And we recognize that the narratives that surround us, the latent knowledge that we are embedded in, is what is preventing us from being able to embrace one another, different communities and different peoples. But I think that what the axis of resistance is doing today is bringing about that change. This is something I find very unique. I find to be actually it's unbelievably gratifying to see people talking with one another, people supporting one another, people praising one another, who maybe 5 or 10 years ago were unwilling to engage. So while these days are very dark for me, for you, for everyone, we wake up with new scenes of horror in Gaza. We wake up to see new scenes of horror in southern Lebanon and elsewhere. But I think that this massive shift in public opinion across the world, this massive change that is taking place within Western countries, and especially among the youth, gives us great hope for the future. I'm optimistic about the future. I think the months and years ahead will be very bloody and painful, but I think ultimately the years ahead will be better than what we are witnessing today. And I think all of us have a responsibility to help push the resistance forward, to spread the resistance, and to make it a more inclusive resistance, something which everyone can feel that they are part of, so that we can end this dark chapter of imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Morandi. As ever, extremely eloquent and extremely insightful remarks. And, just made me think that this media treatment of Iran, the same people that are demonizing Iran as being authoritarian or as being undemocratic are currently showcasing the frankly sad, disastrous state of so-called democracy, capitalist liberal democracy in the West, whose chief representatives are people like Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, or widely despised and hated politicians. Or if you wanted an even worse example, then you look across the Atlantic Ocean to Biden and Trump. Those who caught even a glimpse of the presidential debate a few nights ago will know what I'm talking about. And these are the same people who, in spite of all this, think that they've got the right to decide what any future Palestinian state should look like. They think that they've got the right to say that certain organizations should or shouldn't be part of governing Gaza after this awful conflict has ended. In fact, the Palestinian resistance is engaged in an act of mass democracy, the likes of which these people simply don't have it within them to understand. The next person I'm going to ask to speak is Ramzy Baroud, if he's here. Ramzy is a prolific author, a journalist, and he is the editor of the Palestine Chronicle website. He's the author of five books, including the classic My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story, telling the story of his father and a previous generation of resistance. And I will mention that my son is currently reading it right now and learning a huge amount from it. So please go ahead, Ramzy.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for your respected speakers. It was very fascinating what they said, beautifully articulated, and I've personally learned a lot from it as well. I'm just going to start with this, and my thoughts are going to be a bit more erratic here, just because I really would like to use this medium as an opportunity to kind of explore new ideas. Since this is a critical issue that is being raised by this webinar, rarely do we discuss these issues. And I feel like I want to kind of use it as more as an opportunity to think and maybe discover new things as opposed to make a statement. One thing that I think is quite interesting is the notion that the world was supposedly in a state of a clash of civilization. I wonder if Samuel Huntington, what would he say if we raise this question to him? You said that the future, Mr. Huntington, is that of a clash between major civilizations. Yet, it was non-state actors, namely Ansarullah group, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other socialist groups in Gaza, but also in the West Bank as well, Hezbollah and other resistance groups in Lebanon, groups in Iraq, and elsewhere, non-state actors who have been isolated, designated as terrorists, completely cut off from the global grid of any kind, are the ones who are actually fueling global change as we speak. So it was in the major civilizations of the Asiatic people versus the white people or whatever he was talking about. It was groups that no one would have suspected would have this kind of influence on the way the world is shifting, or in the direction in which the world is shifting. Who would have imagined after 9/11, when American hegemony over the world has taken us to a whole new space of global policing, outright oppression, where you have floating boats of people being tortured throughout the world on floating boats, let alone the prisons of Afghanistan and Guantanamo and Iraq and so forth, that you would have the US military issue such a statement that what Ansarullah are doing is the greatest challenge to the American Navy since World War II. No one was prepared for this. But no one was prepared for this because we were not paying attention. We insisted that change can only happen, and I'm here speaking as a Palestinian, but also as an Arab. We were convinced that the world can only change through Washington and London and Madrid and Paris and elsewhere. Conference after conference that did absolutely nothing to shift the reality, but it shifted the language on Palestine. So we moved from the process of being a national liberation movement in the very act of national liberation to become those desperately seeking peace with Israel and having to constantly jump through so many hoops to prove to Israel that we are worthy of peace with you, you great Israel. And at the end, we lost everything. We even lost our own national unity. The West Bank was carved into yet more settlements, more illegal colonies for Jews only. Gaza became more and more isolated. And Israel went through this habitual mowing the grass of Gaza, meaning every few years they kill a few hundreds or a few thousands, and just restore deterrence and test the new weapons. And then they go and start selling these weapons through all these weapons expos, including, sadly, some Arab countries, where they would sell the weapons that they have tried on their own brethren in Palestine in order for Israel to become one of the top 10 exporters of weapons in the world. When we think of the normalization that took place between some Arab countries and Israel, you have to think of it within that trajectory, that it seemed that all was lost. And the world was shifting away from Palestine, shifting away from the Palestinians, in fact, even shifting away from the global South altogether. America has won, and the world was basically redefining itself around American priorities. Then changes began. Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitical outcomes of that change. Prior to that, in China, particularly China, because the change that was taking place in China was happening in ways that did not really abide by the conflict-driven discourse that the Americans have been pushing throughout the years. In 2012, for example, Obama has decided maybe it's time to leave Iraq. It was a war of choice after all. Yes, maybe we killed millions of innocent people, but that's really not very relevant and immaterial to the conversation. What really matters is that the Chinese are growing with their tentacles all over the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Pacific region, and we need to go there and be out there for our allies. So the pivot to Asia started. The same American game, yet they continued to lose. One thing that I found quite fascinating about this, and I speak here as an intellectual and as an academic, is that one of the signs of that change is that soon after World War II, knowledge was exclusively produced, or almost exclusively produced, in the West and in the United States, where the US in particular had absolute dominance on the production of scientific knowledge. As of a year or two ago, they actually lost to China. The Americans are trying to give us the impression that the war with the Chinese is because of this vile communist regime and all of that. No, there is much more to that story. Stereotypes aside, there is something fundamental that is happening, and we see the shift. The shift is there, but it's not yet enough. There's Brexit Plus, there is a new bank that is going to parallel and hopefully eventually take over from the so-called Washington consensus, this imposition of political terms based on financial needs by the World Bank and the IMF. We need to see a shift happening here. Actually, we need to see more than that. We would like to see an alternative international institutional system, legal, political, and all the rest, that is able to take control of the institutions that have been created by the West, whose political discourse was written by the West, which continues to dominate the world. We recognize that these institutions are failing, but we are desperately imploring to their ethical and moral and legal standards because we have no alternative. It is time to start seeking these alternatives. A lot of changes are happening in Africa, particularly the demise of the French colonial endeavors in Africa. Why are we still speaking about French colonialism in Africa, by the way? I mean, didn't colonialism end in Africa and African countries are all free and liberated? If that is the case, why is France still in charge of the central banks of nearly 15 African countries? So we are very happy and proud of those African countries that have liberated themselves from the ongoing colonialism of the French and other Western countries in Africa. But then Gaza happens. And it took everyone by surprise, including myself. And I'll tell you why, including myself. Because for many years, I've always been arguing, and I've written books about it, that Gaza is the central component of the Palestinian struggle. That maybe Gaza does not have this strategic depth and massive resources. Yes, they do, but it's in the sea and the Israelis are stealing them. Gaza is overpopulated and this does not really factor in as an essential part of Israel's settler colonialism because it doesn't have much land and so much population. But I've always maintained that Gaza will always be the central component of the Palestinian struggle because what keeps Palestinians going throughout these years is the resistance. And I don't want to delve into, this resistance, that resistance. It really is futile and it's not important. What really matters is that Palestinians have resisted. We don't refer to it as resistance, violent or otherwise. We refer to it as muqawama. In Arabic, muqawama means resistance, but in Palestinian lexicon and through the collective Palestinian cultural experience, muqawama has a different feel to it. If you carry a gun, maybe you are part of the muqawama. If you draw a picture, you are part of the muqawama. If you film a TikTok video, you are part of the muqawama. If you are on a hunger strike in an Israeli prison, you are part of the muqawama. A Palestinian woman trying to cross a checkpoint to go to Jerusalem to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque, she is part of the muqawama. The muqawama for us does not adhere to the academic definitions also imposed by Western academia on Palestinians and the rest of the world. But here they are, here is Gaza rising and competing for being one of the most important geostrategic players in the Middle East. And who is rising alongside with them? Hezbollah, Ansarullah, and elsewhere. What I think we keep talking about intersectionality and do excuse me for if my thoughts are a little bit all over the place, but we keep talking about intersectionality. Again, an academic concept. You have to sit there and explain to people how intersectionality works, your solidarity, my solidarity, they intersect, we help each other. You don't need to explain this to Ansarullah and to Hamas and to Hezbollah and to elsewhere. When the American envoy went to Hezbollah and indirectly told them that maybe, what do you want? What do you want in order for you to stop fighting against Israel? As long as you stay away from Gaza and you de-link your cause from that of the Palestinians. And they said, we will only stop when Gaza tells us to stop. So suddenly, tiny little Gaza is now this powerful agent that is able to actually direct the action of a powerful group like the resistance, Lebanese resistance. The same thing in Yemen. They tried to bribe the Yemenis in Oman repeatedly. What do you want? We want absolutely nothing except of food being allowed into Gaza and for the war to stop. That's real intersectionality. That's how it works. That's how you create these local actors who are suddenly regional actors who are suddenly global actors. And this is the change that is happening. This is the fundamental change that is taking place. If you look at Western media, they are somewhere else in their thinking. It will take 2 years to finish Hamas and Rafah. No, 5. Well, maybe I can finish it in 6 months. Nonsense. They are talking absolute nonsense. And now they are yet catching up with the rest of us. Well, it turned out that Hamas is an idea. Well, what did you think? What did you think Hamas was? And you cannot defeat ideas, but you can defeat them and dismember them militarily, but the idea will always be there. They are intellectually inept, ahistorical, and incapable of fathoming and understanding the changes that are happening across the globe. When a country like Spain today officially joins the ICJ's South Africa's case against Israel in the ICJ, accusing it of committing genocide, as it surely is, and then Chile is also added to that mix. What does that tell you? You have Africa, you have South America, and even Western countries in Western Europe breaking ranks, not only with American political diktats, but with the American and Western political discourse, accusing Israel of genocide. That's a massive change that would have not happened if it were not for the resistance. Today as well, the Arab League, of all of its might, has decided, you know what, we're not going to refer to Hezbollah as a terrorist group anymore, because they have decided to do so at the behest of some Arab countries, Israel and the United States in 2016. Why? What has happened that suddenly made Hezbollah not a terrorist group? You would say, well, because they are standing in solidarity with the Palestinians. Why would Arab countries that whether openly or tacitly support Israel care about this? Because Hezbollah is now a powerful political agent and actor. And they want to be able to talk to Hezbollah, perhaps bribe Hezbollah, perhaps try to deviate Hezbollah's attention from Gaza and so forth. But they are scared. They are scared of the outcomes that are going to follow this. And I think no matter what directions this war takes, the outcome is going to be the same. I think the outcome has already been declared on October 7, October 8th. Everything that Netanyahu has done is like a gambler. And I'm not a gambler, by the way, but gamblers think that way. That's my understanding, is that you go and gamble and you lose. And yet in the process of you losing, you realize, well, I mean, I've lost everything anyway. Maybe I will use my credit card. Maybe I will borrow a little bit from here and there. And I promise I will be able to catch up and I will be able to make up for my losses, but they never do. And that's what Netanyahu is doing. So he's sinking and sinking and sinking in Gaza. And instead of trying to get out of Gaza and count his losses, he is turning to Lebanon, trying to provoke a war. He's trying to do this, trying to do that. But there's absolutely nothing they could do that would change the outcomes. And there is nothing that their benefactors in Washington could do that could possibly change the outcome. Over 2,000-pound bombs, bunker busters have been dropped over Gaza. I mean, I am from Gaza. I know Gaza. When we used to run long distance in Gaza, we couldn't go from all the way from Rafah to Beit Hanun in the north because it's that small. So we needed to deviate from Khan Yunis to Deir al-Balah to Bureij and Nusayrat all the way to finish a single marathon. It's that small. Where are all these bombs being dropped? Yet they still cannot bomb a new outcome out of the reality of Gaza. And they will reach that realization that it's impossible to change the outcome, but that's going to happen at the expense of 70, 80, 100, 1,000 innocent Palestinians every single day. The Palestinians have made a choice, and the choice is there will be no other Nakba. No matter what Israel does, we cannot control those who are imposing a genocide on us, but we can control our reaction. The reaction is that of absolute courage and tenacity, the kind of courage that we can't really express by mere words because we can't really truly understand or appreciate, because it's almost out of this world. The courage and the power of Gaza is not independent, though. It gets a lot of support and a lot of meaning and value from the solidarity that exists in other Arab countries, what I call the new Arabs. This whole idea that the Arabs are those in the Arab League and Egypt and few traditional Arab, corrupt Arab regimes, no. The Arabs are whomever defines himself as someone who looks at the cause of the Arabs in a collective way. The new Arab resistance is happening in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Palestine, in Yemen, and elsewhere. And more beautifully and more importantly, there is no clash of civilization, Mr. Huntington, because Iran, a great Persian civilization, is standing hand in hand with those revolutionary Arabs to change the collective fate of that region, because enough is enough. Gaza has made that very clear. Many others are standing in solidarity with Gaza, and eventually Gaza will win. In fact, despite of all the pain and loss, Gaza is already winning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baroud, for that. Again, extremely insightful and extremely powerful contribution. And it's so true, the point you make about people breaking ranks with their leaderships, people breaking ranks with the imperialist consensus, which is really breaking down. In Britain, people are breaking ranks with the political mainstream, with their so-called political leadership, be it in the Conservative Party, be it in the Labour Party, such that 1 million people will come out in the streets in support of Palestine, in support of Gaza, in opposition to genocide, in opposition to ethnic cleansing, in opposition to apartheid. And that's a level of mobilization that we haven't actually seen since 2003, since before the Iraq War. And there's no other issue that unites people in this country to the same degree, it seems to me, than support for the national rights of the Palestinian people. And we're seeing the same in the US, with brave students throughout the country setting up their encampments and demanding divestment, demanding boycott, demanding sanctions of the Israeli apartheid warriors. And what's especially profound and especially new and especially kind of moving is to see that Jewish communities, Jewish people, especially young people, are breaking ranks with their kind of historic political leaders and breaking ranks with Zionism in order to show solidarity and to oppose genocide and to respect the basic national rights and the basic human rights of Palestinian people. So thank you so much again. Our next speaker is going to be Loki. Unfortunately, Loki is campaigning today. He's up in Derby campaigning on behalf of Chris Williamson, who's standing as a candidate for the Workers' Party of Britain on a pro-Palestine platform, of course. But Loki has sent us a pre-recorded video. Loki, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with him. He's a journalist, a rapper, an academic, and a campaigner. He's really tireless in his efforts to provide a voice for the oppressed. He's done a huge amount of work in solidarity with Palestine, as well as campaigning for the victims of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and campaigning on behalf of refugees. And along the way, he's made some truly classic music that's really provided the soundtrack to a generation of radical struggle. So Paul, if you could share Loki's video, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me at this important event today. I appreciate the invitation from Carlos, and unfortunately have had to pre-record my contribution. I wish I was there to hear the contribution of the others. So to start with, when looking at the question of Palestine and particularly the genocide in Gaza now, considering that Israel essentially is an extension of European imperialism and colonialism around the world, often a lot of our energy is focused on what is happening in Britain and that great offshoot of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, the United States of America. A lot is focused on what they are doing vis-a-vis Palestine. And so if we look at it, we have a brief appraisal. What you have is the United States, Germany, Canada, and Britain helping Israel in a plethora of ways. So to start with, the United States has, since October 7th, provided Israel with over $6 billion of military aid. There's been tens of thousands of tons of weapons transported to Israel by the United States throughout the genocide. Of course, Israel has a secret stash of US weapons in the Negev Desert, which it has full access to. The M9 Reaper drones have been flying above Gaza. One of their specialities is target acquisition. Those are US Air Force flights. We also know that US Air Force officers have been with the Israeli military personnel in the operating theaters assisting with targeting. We also know that early on the US Delta Force was on the ground. You have some US mercenary organizations like the Forward Observations Group who have gone straight from fighting in Ukraine with the Azov Battalion into fighting in Gaza with the Israeli military. On the British side of the question, you had questions early on that the SAS was involved, and that led to a D-notice being issued by the government telling the media not to publish anything about SAS operations regarding Gaza. What you also have is the R1 shadow spy plane above Gaza on a daily basis. Again, one of its specialities is target acquisition, and that is a Royal Air Force plane. You also have Britain granting over 100 arms licenses to the Israelis throughout the war. The British side of the arms exports is largely components, but then you also have Israeli arms companies functioning in Britain like Elbit Systems or Rafael, who will obviously be exporting some of their goods over to Israel. Throughout this, the Akrotiri base in Cyprus has been really, really essential to this whole process, not only in surveilling the communication of the resistance and sharing that with the NSA and then with the Israelis, but also in weapons flights by both the US and Britain into the Zionist entity in order to continue its war on Gaza. In terms of Germany, you have had an increase in arms sales over 1,000% during this period. They've created a whole new fast-tracking system for Germany to arm Israel. In terms of Canada, Canadian exports to Israel have obviously increased. They are big on the component side of the equation also. Now, if we look at the other more important side of this question, what has been the role of the main players in the global south in pushing back against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and then coming out of that genocide, what is likely to be Israel's relationship with what is essentially the future of humanity we're talking about here? Well, first we have to analyze how is it the regional forces have been able to resist what Israel does. So one key part of the resistance in the region has been the Yemeni armed forces. Now, it is a simple statement of fact that they would not have had the space or the ability or the capacity to launch their humanitarian intervention by practicing a sanction regime on Israel by blocking ships. They would not have been able to do that were it not for peace in Yemen between the Saudi side and the UAE and the Yemeni side. And that was facilitated by the Chinese government putting pressure on Saudi Arabia in order to get the good deals that it has obtained with China, obviously, and the good working relationship that it has, in order to bring first Saudi Arabia and Iran to the table, an agreement which has led to the exchange of diplomatic representatives, but then led to a deal in Yemen that led to a cessation of the immense human suffering which was unleashed by the Saudi, US, and British proxy war in Yemen. Now, part of that is wrapped up in China's extensive, comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran. China agreed to invest over 400 billion in Iran over 25 years. Now, that led to an opening of space for the resistance factions in the region, because it is a known fact, as has been stated by whether it's Ziad Nakhala of the Jihad al-Islami, or it's Talal Naji of Jabha Sha'biya li-Tahrir Palestine, or it is Ismail Haniyeh from Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. Every single one of them have stated very, very clearly that Iran has contributed billions to the Palestinian resistance factions over the last decades. Now, in a situation where China has become more integrated with Iran economically, and increasingly there is, while Iran militarily is more integrated with Russia, there are signs, which I will get into later, of a developing relationship between Iran and China, obviously. Now, that then has consequences for the Palestinian resistance factions, as we've stated. Now, when you look at, for instance, the unprecedented move by Iran to strike Israel with ballistic missiles and with drones, al-Wa'd al-Sadiq, as it was known, Iranian missile guiding systems actually used a Chinese company and a Russian company, Bidu, which is a Chinese company, and GLONASS, which is a Russian company. Now, this greatly frustrated and infuriated the Israelis. And actually, there is a silent but considerable and significant war going on between, on one side, the Israelis, and on the other side, the Chinese, and also the Russians, to differing extents. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Immediately after October 7th, China obstructed the dual-use civil military exports to Israel. Now, Israel publicly stated that it considered this to be a form of sanctions being practiced by Beijing upon them. In addition to that, when Israel cancelled the work permits of tens of thousands of Palestinians who no longer are able to work in the political unit of Israel, they looked to fill that void with Chinese workers. Now, not only did the Chinese government not facilitate that, prior October 7th, you had 30,000 Chinese workers in Israel. 20,000 left. And then China stopped those 20,000 from going back. And in addition to that, stopped new workers from going and filling that gap, particularly in the construction industry. So, of course, then Israel has had to go to Ecuador and India to try and fill that employment gap. What you also have is the port that China has invested so much into, Haifa, during this period, fell 70% under the control of an Indian billionaire, despite all of the expense that Chinese companies had gone to try and invest in that port. So it's an interesting state of affairs. In addition to that, Israel has claimed that they found Chinese weapons in Gaza. What that means is another question, but I would say it's indicative of something. Also, the convergence of interests between the war lobby and military-industrial complex stooges in US Congress and the Israel lobby in militating so hard against TikTok also has some element of a push against China and this sort of strategic tug of war that is developing. Also, we know that China refused to condemn Hamas following October 7th, and that also China has in the past condemned Israeli settlement building and sought to ban its citizens from any form of involvement in that. Now, on the other side of this question, you look at the Russian relationship with Israel. Now, Ali Baraka, who is a key figure in the political office of Hamas, stated after October 7th that Russia had granted licenses to the Palestinian resistance factions to locally produce Kalashnikovs and Kalashnikov bullets. And this absolutely enraged the Israelis. Another thing that was stated by key figures in Hamas following October 7th was that Russia had been in contact with them and promised to use the Al-Aqsa flood as a prototype in its military schools. And again, this was something that Israel is greatly opposed to. So now you see a situation where in November, Israeli banks began to introduce restrictions on accounts belonging to Russian nationals, which was in line with the sanctions regime that the West had attempted to apply on Russia following the operation in Ukraine. When we look at the other BRICS nations, of course, Iran is now a member of the BRICS. South Africa, it's well known the position that South Africa has taken on the genocide in Gaza. And of course, Brazil has been very outspoken in stating this is genocide taking place in Gaza and has actually been part of a push in Latin America to support the Palestinians more clearly than before. So, of course, India has, according to some accounts, it's been arming Israel, and it has, in some cases, apparently been sending individual mercenaries, a small number, to join the Israeli military in this campaign, and also plugged the employment gap in the labor market left by Israeli reservists and Palestinians who have been taken out of it. So overall, the picture for Israel, when looking at the global south and looking at its future, it has a circle which it cannot square. And that circle is that the vast majority of humanity are actually post-colonial subjects. And when they look at the Palestinian equation and Zionism as an idea, they see themselves reflected in the Palestinians as post-colonial subjects, and they relate to them in a way that they just cannot relate to Israel. So I think going forward, we are going to see a very interesting dynamic develop, especially with the elevation of global South economies and the fall of Israel's traditional partners like the United States, Britain, Canada, less so Germany. So it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic that develops. Thank you for having me today. I really wish I was there to hear the rest of the talks. I'm sure they will be very, very useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loki, for that characteristically well-researched and thoughtful presentation, which was really super interesting. And thanks to Loki also for taking the time to do that pre-record. And I'm sure we all wish him well with his campaigning today. Really interesting to look at this comparison between China and the United States in terms of engagement with the current escalation of the conflict in Palestine. From the beginning, from October 7th onwards, China's been working very hard towards a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire by Israel. It's been pushing that at the United Nations Security Council, and the US, of course, has put every hurdle and every obstacle in the way of that, in the way of achieving a ceasefire and achieving consensus at the United Nations level. China has called for increasing and has increased its humanitarian aid to Palestine, whereas the US, of course, has cut its funding even for UNRWA. China has very specifically at the ICJ recognized the right under international law of colonized peoples to armed resistance, whereas on the other hand, the United States, of course, defines Hamas and defines PFLP and defines PIJ as terrorist groups. And China's been actively promoting the unity of the Palestinian factions. It's hosted unity talks and reconciliation talks in Beijing of Hamas and Fatah and other groups, while the US, of course, incessantly promotes division among the Palestinian groups. So the contrast kind of couldn't be starker. So thanks very much to Loki for bringing some of those ideas out. The next speaker is going to be Bikram Gill. Bikram is a scholar of international political economy. He's long been involved in anti-war and anti-imperialist campaigns and has most recently joined the International People's Tribunal on US Imperialism as a special rapporteur. He's author of the forthcoming book, The Political Ecology of Colonial Capitalism, Race, Nature, and Accumulation. Bikram, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to thank the organizers of the event again, as others have said, for kind of prompting us and organizing such an important discussion. I think many of us have been thinking around and feeling our way through, and so it's good to have a more structured space in which to have this conversation. I want to begin just with a brief note. I know others have mentioned this kind of strange feeling that we have, simultaneously a feeling that we are living through a moment of profound change and transformation, where the Western imperial order is being brought to crisis in a way perhaps it hasn't. That Palestinian liberation is nearer than it has been, but at the same time, each day brings more and more horrors, and it's simply demonstrating to us the foundations of the Western world order is an assault on all of our humanity. And I think we see that in the transformation of hospitals into death camps, in the total destruction of Gaza's entire education sector, the horrors we saw just yesterday in Gaza City and again in Rafah. So I think we need to hold both of those, simultaneously having a feeling of a movement towards liberation, but not letting go of and forgetting this horror that we're living through. And there must be accountability, and we must push those of us in the core to continue to disrupt and do what we can to bring this, however we can, to work with resistance forces to bring this to an end, because it's truly shocking that this has gone on for 9 months. I know I don't need to say this, everybody knows this, but I just wanted to begin with that. And I dropped a link in the chat to a website that's called, I think, Gaza Funds. I think you can find it somewhere in the chat. I think it's very important that we also, as far as we can, support, donate, and share links for Palestinians in Gaza who've had their homes obliterated, who are trying to either escape or rebuild. And so whatever you can do to support that, please consider doing so. The link is in the chat. So I'm going to, in my comments today, I'm going to kind of build on a lot of what's already been said. I'm going to be thinking about things like the convergence between the kind of emergent multipolar world and what's happening in Palestine, both in terms of the genocidal assault and the resistance and the implications for this. Now, why is it important to have this focus? I mean, it is increasingly evident, as speakers have pointed out, that this is not simply, we cannot understand this as Israel's genocide or a Zionist genocide against Palestinians. We can see how it grows out of Zionism's settler colonial character, but this genocide and the settler colonial project itself is simply impossible without its imperialist backstop, right? Now, I know people have already read out the issue of weapons transfers. Tens of thousands of 2,000-pound bombs have been transferred, thousands of 500-pound bombs, Hellfire missiles. Without this, Israel could not continue doing what it's doing. So it's very clear at a material basis that this is not simply an Israeli genocide. It is a U.S.-Israeli genocide. In the U.S. is at the forefront of a Western imperial order. Why? This is a question that we're trying to work through. Why is Palestine, the subjugation of Palestine, the genocide against Palestinians, why is this so central to the preservation of the Western imperialist order? This is a question I'm going to try to work through today. And then on the other side, why is Palestinian liberation so key to the final achievement of anti-imperialism, of a world free of a US-led Western imperialist order? Now, in saying this, the point is not to diminish the struggle against Zionist colonialism, but to demonstrate how the struggle against Zionism and US imperialism are inextricably intertwined. That Zionism has always relied on imperialism in the construction of its quote-unquote iron wall premise. And Zionism, in turn, is a necessary bulwark proxy for the reproduction of specifically US imperialism, the form it's taken since the second half of the 20th century, of the reproduction of US imperialism in the region, but also globally. So that's kind of some things I'm going to focus on. Now, just a word before I begin. I'm going to come back to this at the end. Just a word on Western imperialism more generally. There's a fantastic book by an author named Enrique Dussel. It's called The Invention of the Americas. Now, in this book, what Enrique Dussel, he's tracing the emergence of Western imperialism and colonialism from the 16th century conquest of the Americas through to the 20th century when he wrote the book. And he makes this really, I think, very provocative claim that is really demonstrating itself today, where he argues that there's a myth of modernity that Western imperialism advances. And this myth is that it's founded on rationality. But he's making the point that, in fact, Western imperialism has an irrational premise. And what I'm going to try to end by, if I have time, is to show that it's returning to its irrational premise today. In light of challenges to the basis of US-led Western imperialism, to its economic and military basis, it seeks to return to this irrational premise. Now, what does Dussel mean by an irrational premise? What he means is that from the Spanish conquest of the Americas onwards, the Western imperialism, rather than being founded on a rational intercourse with other cultures, with other civilizations, rather than founding its markets and its economic development on a real rational basis, it's founded on absolute violent domination. You know, it seeks to impose total military domination and defeat of subjugated peoples. And upon that ground, then it seeks to construct discourse or treaties or agreements, right? So it wants a totally disarmed partner, a totally defeated partner. And that is also the terms of capitalism itself, right? Total violent dispossession of workers, colonized people, etc. So there's an irrational basis in which the implication here is that the colonizing and imperialist forces cannot coexist on a egalitarian, on a mutual basis, with the non-Western and global South world. And I think that's where we're at today, specifically in a lot of the ceasefire discussions, what is being demanded, right? So just a brief note on that. And I think before now getting into U.S. imperialism more specifically, one more brief note on what do I mean by imperialism? So if it has an irrational basis, but imperialism in a capitalist world system is a mode of power that is premised also upon maintaining monopoly control, not over territory per se, but over the flow of capital across territories. This is a key point about capitalism. And this is very important to keep in mind, because in the 20th century, you can have projects of decolonization, movements of decolonization that don't overturn the imperialist system. So you can become individually free. You can individually overcome your colonial ruler, but you find yourself entrapped in relations of dependency. Now, this is imperialism because it maintains monopoly control over the flow of capital across territory. It can then impose conditions on peripheral states that need access to that capital. And by imposing conditions, it can set prices. And by setting prices, it can transfer surplus value from periphery to core. Now, this has been the basis. So I guess the point I'm making there again is there has been a huge wave of decolonization from the 20th century onwards, but the imperialist question was never really brought to crisis, to challenge until today. Yeah, so the basis of imperialism on an international scale, its economic and military basis, is really only now being brought to crisis. It's been a long road. It's been unfolding, you can say, since the Korean War, since the revolution in China, even earlier, as we were saying, the Russian Revolution, but it's really now being brought to crisis. Now, the Zionist regime the Zionist entity is one that is founded on that point I just made, on total violent domination of the indigenous Palestinians, and is on that basis, on disarming and annihilating Palestinians, that both Zionism and British imperialism sought to then construct the terms of whatever peace or treaties would be established between Palestinians and Zionists. So that's the term they're always going to try to return to, is to try to totally decimate and disarm and return Palestinians to a condition of being disempowered, where they simply have to beg for and accept whatever is given to them by the colonizers and imperialists. Now, why is this so central to U.S. imperialism? Okay, so let me now just try to work through the U.S. imperial order. So U.S. imperialism, of course, really consolidates, and the U.S. becomes the major imperial power after World War II. But what is significant for what I want to focus on the discussion today is what really happens to U.S. imperialism from the 1960s and 70s onwards. Okay, so after World War II, the U.S. is the primary economic power because the rest of the world has been decimated by the wars from 1915 to 1945. The global South is either colonized or coming out of this. But by the 1960s and 70s, the United States, the U.S. imperial order enters into a very serious crisis, right? So the Vietnam War challenges the military basis of U.S. imperialism. And then there's rising inter-capitalist competition between the U.S. and Germany and Japan, which challenges the economic basis of U.S. imperialism, and also rising global South states that have achieved decolonization that are seeking to advance sovereign industrial projects also starts eating into U.S. economic power and the U.S. ability to appropriate surplus value from the rest of the world. Now, the dual crisis, the Vietnam War and declining economic competitiveness imposes on the U.S. is it brings the U.S. dollar to crisis, where even the U.S. allies start to call into U.S. dollar in the 1960s and 70s, claiming that the U.S. gold standard can no longer hold. Of course, we know this leads to the U.S. delinking the dollar from gold, right? And it also leads to, at this time, an overaccumulation crisis. So you have rising competition between the U.S. and its allies, but also with global South states rising. And the solution that the U.S. comes to, with even the problem with the dollar being challenged or weakened, and this overaccumulation crisis, it delinks the dollar from gold, and then it will relink the dollar to oil. And this is where I think the West Asian region, the Middle Eastern region, is really pivotal to understanding how the U.S. has tried to forestall what's been a declining imperialism for the last 50 years, a declining basis of their economic order. Now the challenge to the military and economic basis of U.S. imperialism is again renewed, intensified in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, right? But the U.S. responds to this war with a rapid and massive support of Israel through a rapid weapons transfer, massive airlift of weapons on an emergency basis to Israel. And through that process of kind of rescuing and saving Israel from the Yom Kippur War, the United States is able to demonstrate again and reinforce an overwhelming military dominance in the region. And by doing so, it demonstrates to Egypt in particular, or it is able to force, and I don't have time to get into this right now, it forces Egypt away from the Soviet Union and into the US order. But even more significantly, what it does is it is able to then compel Saudi Arabia or demonstrate to Saudi Arabia that its interests lie in linking up with the US in exchanging a security deal for the Saudis agreeing to sell oil only in US dollars. And this creates something that's referred to as a dollar Wall Street regime or the petrodollar. And it is through the petrodollar that the US is able to reestablish monopoly control over the flow of capital across the world, right? So this is a really fundamental kind of renewal of US imperialism at this time. And the now this mechanism of the dollar doesn't really get to the heart of the problem of decaying US imperialism, which is its declining productive base, its declining competitiveness, but it does kind of forestall the issue. Now, what does the petrodollar enable? It enables the US to overcome the crisis of overaccumulation. It enables the US to lead the West out of this problem, because what it does is it generates massive petrodollars, which are then recycled back to the West via arms sales. So either the Saudis and other Gulf states will purchase arms from the US, which renews the motor of accumulation for Western states, or through purchasing US Treasury bonds, right? So what this does is it restores the US as a reserve currency and forces even its allies to hold US dollars, which provisions the United States with a financial power through which it's able to essentially skim off the top of a majority of economic transactions in the world system. And it's through this financialized regime that the US is ultimately able, as we know the familiar story, to impose a debt crisis upon the global South in the 80s and 90s and enforce structural adjustment and once again deny the sovereignty to global South states. And it's able to restore its, for briefly, its military bases. Now, this has bearings on, I guess, Palestine as well in this time, because this leads to the Oslo framework, where Palestinians, again, are disarmed and forced to beg for their rights and hope that a state will come. But the result we know is more land theft. Now, this is that end of history framework that Carlos had mentioned at the outset. And so it seemed as though the US imperial order had been renewed and reestablished by the 1990s, particularly on the basis of a financial and military power that can enforce dependency, a financial and militarized regime of accumulation that could overcome the profitability crisis, the accumulation crisis that reared its head in the 1970s. But however, as we know today, that was a kind of a false or a misleading historical moment. That was not the end of history. That actually, since the 1980s and 90s, both the economic and military basis of US imperialism has been shown to be flimsy, to be actually quite a paper tiger, to use that language. On the economic leg, we know China has arisen through the US global order to challenge the economic basis of US imperialism. And now this is based on, of course, China's domestic project on nationalization, land reform, and et cetera, but it enabled China to construct surpluses, to appropriate surpluses back from the world market, through which it was able then to help global South states break out of dependency on the World Bank and the IMF. But from the other direction, there was also a challenge to the military basis of US imperial power. And this came through what other speakers have referred to, what ultimately becomes the axis of resistance, right? And I think something that I mention very often, but a key moment here is the rise of the Iranian Revolution, which is a challenge to the US-Saudi oil dollar compact, but also how the Iranian Revolution is able to serve as strategic depth for rising resistance in the region. particularly for Hezbollah, for example, right? And so we know Hezbollah is able to demonstrate a military capacity to undermine Zionist and imperialist deterrence in the region, which leads to repeated losses by Zionists and imperialists from the 1990s into 2000s and onwards, which inspires and motivates the Palestinians to again take up armed struggle, because armed resistance is understood to be the real basis to reclaim sovereign power. So, I mean, I've taken maybe too long, so I'm going to skip ahead to today, and this will all make sense in the context of the contemporary moment. I think something that Loki had mentioned is that the Chinese brokering of the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia last year. Now, I would say what is significant about this détente in relation to what I'm talking about is, the Saudis had attacked Yemen for 8 years at the behest and with the backing of the US and the UK. But it's not just that China comes in and brokers the détente, it's that Saudi Arabia is defeated by the Yemeni resistance, right? And the Yemeni resistance is launched in opposition to is not just in service of achieving Yemeni national liberation, but the Yemeni resistance is informed by an understanding that regional independence, that the expulsion of imperialists and Zionists from the region is necessary for the achievement of sovereignty for all peoples in the region, right? So Yemen, once the Ansarullah comes to power in 2015, and the Saudis respond by seeking to restore the status quo equation through a military invasion. But by 2023, it's very clear that Saudi Arabia cannot achieve military aims, that Ansarullah is firing rockets deeper into Saudi Arabia and hitting oil wells. And it is that moment that the Saudis are more receptive to what China is saying. So China has a global framework called a global development peace, right? A developmental peace. And that's the framework through which they broker this Iran-Saudi détente, because Saudi can't achieve its aims on a military basis. So there's a different road that China offers, which is the one I think Loki was referencing to. Now, this détente then really frightens the United States last summer, right? It suggests that the oil-dollar relationship can be brought to crisis. We see signs, maybe not so significant, of the Saudis selling oil in Chinese currency or participating or being open to the moves away from the US dollar elsewhere. And I think that the United States, in backing, so the US tries to respond to this by actually accelerating normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel in the summer of 2023. And one condition of that normalization was, again, to restore a security architecture to Saudi Arabia, but on the basis that Saudi would promise not to sell oil in the Chinese currency, and to move away from China. So it was essentially, since October 7th, the United States has backed Israel to the hilt. It has provisioned massive weapons, because I think they're trying to renew or trying to reproduce the Yom Kippur formula, right? It's through the Yom Kippur War, they were able to peel Egypt away from the Soviet Union and bring it into the US orbit. I think they're trying to do the same with Saudi Arabia by lifting up Israel, by restoring Zionist power, because the fall of Israel will be the permanent turning away, I think, of Saudi Arabia from the US order, right? So they're trying to renew and reproduce the 1973 equation, but the US would do well right now to remember Marx's dictum that history happens twice. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. And it's the United States and its allies and Zionists, as they're trying to restore the economic and military conditions of their imperialist order, each action only actually undermines their own interests, right? They are returning to that irrational basis with which I began. There's no way in which Zionism or imperialism can actually embrace multipolarity or coexistence between Palestinians and any kind of Zionist state. It is not premised on equal coexistence. It is not premised upon a mutuality, right? It's only on outright domination. That is why after October 7th, there's no room for negotiations. There's no room for actually recognizing the legitimate demands of the October 7th action. It is only to restore the violent basis upon which the West and Israel seek to then construct an order. So I think I can stop there. And sorry for going over time, but yeah, I can address all this stuff in the discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bikram. Really crucial, kind of broad geopolitical perspective, and I especially appreciate you bringing in this factor of, imperialism meaning domination. It's not just a policy set, it means dominating the land, resources, labor, markets, and as you say, flow of capital and goods from one part of the world to the other. And that correctly situates the problem. And a lot of people in pro-Palestine circles tend to think that, the whole issue is just a matter of kind of the Zionist lobby in the US, and that if you could just overcome that, and if you could give them less of a voice, then the whole situation could be resolved. And actually, the issue is that having a white European settler state, a colonial state armed to the teeth, deep in the core of the military-industrial complex, that's been absolutely crucial to US hegemony since the 1950s and continues to be so today, which is why the US continues to double down on its support for the Zionist entity. So the next speaker is going to be Keith Bennett. Keith is a researcher and consultant on China's international relations. He's my fellow co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. He's head of the International Manifesto Group's editorial board, and he's a long-standing and respected analyst of international relations. Go ahead, Keith.
Thank you, Carlos. And on behalf of the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China, I'd like to thank everyone who has supported this webinar, and in particular, all our excellent speakers, most especially our friends from Palestine and Iran, who are on the front line of one of the defining struggles of our time. The theme of our event today refers not simply to the events in Gaza, but also to its regional and global ramifications and the movements it has set in train as constituting changes unseen in a century. And I want to elaborate a bit on why we consider this phrase, most often associated with Chinese President Xi Jinping, to be apposite in this context. The struggle of the Palestinian people for self-determination, for the right to found their own independent state, is not new. It has continued for over a century, at least since British imperialism issued the notorious Balfour Declaration on November 2nd, 1917. And it is surely an interesting reflection on how the struggle of the Palestinian people has always paralleled the wider movement for human liberation, has always embodied the dialectic of the struggle between progress and reaction, that the working class of Petrograd, under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, seized power and, in Lenin's words, began the construction of the socialist order just 4 days later. There had been many attempts to extinguish the Palestinian dream of a state of their own, but perhaps imperialism and its allied Zionist state have never felt so triumphalist as in the period immediately preceding the launch of the Al-Aqsa Storm on October 7th, 2023. In 2020, US imperialism had unveiled the Abraham Accords, in many respects a tawdry commercial deal cloaked in a thin veil of faux religiosity, but which had as its goal the securing on the part of the reactionary Arab regimes of a final betrayal of the Palestinian cause, without securing so much as a glimmer of even a two-state solution. The first to establish diplomatic relations with Israel under this framework was the United Arab Emirates, UAE, closely followed by Bahrain. These were the first Arab countries to normalize relations with Israel since Jordan in 1994. In a nauseatingly cynical twist, Morocco followed suit in exchange for the United States recognizing its sovereignty over Western Sahara, which Morocco illegally occupies. Sudan was unable to follow through on its own normalization solely on account of the internecine strife that swept over that country. And whilst there was talk of possible similar moves on the part of Oman, or even further afield Pakistan or Malaysia, the real prize was always Saudi Arabia, given not least its centrality in the Muslim Ummah as the custodian of the two holy places. That rapprochement between Riyadh and Tel Aviv was widely seen as drawing ever closer as the clock ticked towards October 7. No wonder, therefore, that on September 22nd, with his customary racist arrogance, Benjamin Netanyahu, while beating the drum for war against Iran, could unfold before the United Nations General Assembly a map of the so-called New Middle East, from which Palestine was completely erased, the Zionist project from the river to the sea, if not beyond, that has always been the core mission of his Likud party, not to mention the founding fathers of the white supremacist and settler colonialist ideology of Zionism. If Israel sought to copper fasten its regional hegemony, this dovetailed neatly with US imperialism's global hegemonic ambitions, which at the present time center above all on its new Cold War against socialist China. On September the 20th, 2 days before Netanyahu's address to the United Nations, the G20 summit in New Delhi was the venue for the unveiling of the US-sponsored India-Israel Middle East European Union Corridor, or IMEC, itself but the latest US attempt to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and specifically in this instance, to undermine and disrupt China's energy security. Such was imperialism's triumphalist conceit that they had finally exorcised the spectre of the Palestinian Revolution, that on October the 2nd, Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, who reports directly to President Biden, wrote in Foreign Affairs, the House Journal of the US Foreign Policy Establishment, that, quote, "The Middle East has never been so calm as it is today." Just 5 days later, that calm was well and truly shattered. This dramatic turn brings to my mind the words of Padraig Pearse, speaking in 1915 at the funeral of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, less than 1 year before the heroic Easter Rising in Dublin, when Pearse stated, "They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." Clearly, the fools have not yet learned their lesson, even after all these years. We do not imagine that the reactionary Arab regimes have changed their spots. However, if they wish to continue sitting on their thrones and in their presidential palaces, then further normalization with Israel appears to be off the table for the foreseeable future, without at least some serious steps towards justice for the Palestinians. Netanyahu and all the other fascists in his government can rail all they like against the prospect of a Palestinian state. But as of this month, 145 of the 193 member states of the United Nations already recognize the state of Palestine, with, as we heard earlier, Norway, Ireland, Spain, and Slovenia leading the way in terms of a further wave of European recognition. With steps towards the issuing of a warrant by the International Criminal Court for the arrest of the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu will have to be very careful as to which countries he visits for the rest of his miserable life. More and more countries are supporting the brave stance of South Africa, charging Israel with the crime of genocide at the International Court of Justice, including not just numerous countries of the Global South, but now even such European powers as Belgium and Spain. This is a development that could not have been contemplated in Washington, London, or Tel Aviv. Regarding the wider international context, as early as last October the 8th, our comrades of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, wrote that the Al-Aqsa Storm was, quote, "a move to prevent the Arab regimes from signing peace agreements with Israel and derail American attempts to build economic blocs in the region to besiege China, Iran, and Russia, the most recent of which is the India, Middle East, Europe corridor." In this sense, the Palestinian resistance has already secured an immense victory. US imperialism and Israeli Zionism are increasingly rejected by almost the entire global South, and, admittedly in a more partial way, by a growing number of intermediate and middle powers in the global North as well. Not only their Israeli attack dogs, but increasingly their master, US imperialism, the ringleader of world reaction as well, are facing an unprecedented degree of global condemnation, repudiation, and isolation. Of course, we know that the Palestinian people have paid and are paying a terrible, cruel, and almost unbearable price for their heroic resistance, for their determination to be free and to serve the cause of oppressed people everywhere by helping to bury imperialism in the rubble of Gaza. I do not have to give here the details of the savagery they are enduring. It is brought to us daily in all its heart-rending awfulness, not least thanks to the heroic women and men journalists and camera crews, particularly of Al Jazeera, who remain standing in their place at any cost so that the world may see and know the truth. But let us be clear, every atrocity committed against our Palestinian sisters and brothers is another nail in the coffin of imperialism and Zionism. In the words of Terence McSweeney, Lord Mayor of Cork, who died on hunger strike in London's Brixton prison on October the 25th, 1920, mourned by Ho Chi Minh along the route of his funeral procession, and by Guo Moreau, a future senior leader of the Chinese party and government, in poetry written from Japan, it is not those who can inflict the most, but those who can endure the most who will conquer. The courage and heroism of the Palestinian people during these last nearly 9 months of genocidal aggression in particular stands alongside that of the Soviet people through the nearly 7 months of the Battle of Stalingrad and through the 872 days from September 1941 to January 1944 of the brutal siege of Leningrad, and indeed with the heroic Jewish defenders of the Warsaw Ghetto as they took on the Nazis of their day. Despite almost 9 months of genocidal aggression, imperialism and Zionism have only tasted the bitter fruits of defeat, of unprecedented international isolation, and an absence of any lasting results on the battlefield. When the Israelis commit yet another atrocity in Rafah, their soldiers pay the price in Gaza City, the Palestinian people having learned well the military art of people's war. As even the spokesperson of the Israeli Armed Forces, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, was recently forced to admit, this business of destroying Hamas, making Hamas disappear, it's simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a party. It's rooted in the hearts of the people. Anyone who thinks we can eliminate Hamas is wrong. Already, in his May 23rd, 1970 statement, with his tremendous farsightedness and extraordinary prescience, Comrade Mao Zedong pointed out, in the world of today, who actually fears whom? It is not the Vietnamese people, the Laotian people, the Cambodian people, the Palestinian people, the Arab people, or the people of other countries who fear US imperialism. It is US imperialism which fears the people of the world. It becomes panic-stricken at the mere rustle of leaves in the wind. Innumerable facts prove that a just cause enjoys abundant support, while an unjust cause finds little support. A weak nation can defeat a strong. A small nation can defeat a big. The people of a small country can certainly defeat aggression by a big country, if only they dare to rise in struggle, dare to take up arms, and grasp in their own hands the destiny of their country. This is a law of history. And this is the change unseen in a century that the Palestinian people are helping to bring about with the blood of their martyrs and the lives of their children, the defeat of imperialism and its supersession by a community of shared future for humanity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keith. Those very comprehensive and very profound remarks, and I especially appreciated, I'm sure other people did as well, the fact that you brought in the parallel with Ireland and the Irish struggle against colonialism, because apart from anything else, we've seen this mass outpouring of solidarity from Ireland, and it really is a case that one colonized people recognizes another. And in the case of Ireland, of course, Palestine's colonization was created by at the same hands that created Ireland's colonization. The potato famine and the Balfour Declaration were the work of essentially the same social class in the same country. And and it's generally the case and globally the case that oppressed people everywhere recognize themselves in Palestine right now, and their voices are united in the cry for a free Palestine. So we've just got one more speaker, Fuad Bakr of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Unfortunately, Fuad is not able to get into the Zoom meeting for some or other technical issue that I haven't been able to resolve with him, but he has sent me the text of his speech, so I'm going to read it out. After that, I mean, this is a bit of a marathon of a meeting already. We're coming up to the 2 hours mark. So after I read out Fuad's speech, then I suggest we just go back to the panelists for a couple of minutes each to if they want to come back on anything that other panelists have said or anything in the chat, and then we close the event then, because we will have gone on for more than 2 hours at that point. So Faoud is a member of the International Criminal Court Bar Association and the head of the legal department of the DFLP. The DFLP is a Marxist-Leninist party, part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it plays a full active part in the resistance of the Palestinian people against Zionism and imperialism. So just to reiterate, I'm going to read out his speech from the text that he sent me via email. And yeah, great. So the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War led to the emergence of a unipolar world characterized by the dominance of the US and its Western allies. This system was characterized by a set of so-called liberal values that the imperialist powers forcibly spread to other countries of the world as a condition for joining the international community. The US, which presented itself as the moral guide of humanity, imposed the rules of the global political game. Since 1991, this regime has been extending its control over the globe, especially the countries of the global south, despite their lack of attraction to it. And because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it the non-aligned movement, they found themselves floundering alone without a compass to guide them ideologically or strategically. So it was they must adhere to the imposed rules and principles to avoid being labeled rogue states or thrown to the sidelines of international issues. However, since the end of the 1990s, the global economies has witnessed a shift in the international balance of power embodied in the economic superiority of BRICS over the G7, gradually penetrating also into the international political arena. The countries of this bloc, with their emerging markets, began seeking to transform their newly emerging economic weight into an actual political and diplomatic force, united by a common denominator, which is that they do not belong to NATO, but rather to the global south, not to mention their shared feeling of the humiliation that befell them during colonialism or as a result of it. The imperialist powers tightened control over it and kept it on the margins of the global system, which prompted them to clearly and explicitly demand actual recognition of it and the achievement of equal treatment and balanced representation within the contemporary global governance system. The BRICS bloc has gradually become the locomotive of a transformed world, propelling a will that intends to radically reform the international system and categorically rejects the current system and all the defects and hypocrisy that it carries within it. While the imperialist countries impose principles that they claim are universal on a large part of the world, they do not stop adopting a policy of double standards to distance themselves from their allies, thus inevitably arousing the anger and discontent of the people. Palestine represents a symbol for those countries that bear witness with their own eyes to the last situation in the world that is still suffering under the yoke of colonialism and has not succeeded in breaking its restrictions to embrace freedom like others. Thus, it represents the last thread that connects the countries of the global south to their past, what prevents them as it prevents all of humanity from turning the page on the humiliation of colonialism and overcoming it once and for all. Palestine, the essence of the identity of free peoples in the world, is echoing today throughout the globe, shaking it. It embodies, in a blatant and clear way, the double standards of the imperialist countries through the acquittal of Israel of all the horrific crimes it has committed and is committing under the pretext of its alleged and absolute right. In defending itself, this right is more important to the West than preserving Palestinian lives. Palestine has also become a symbol of the American failure to influence its Israeli ally in order to reach a just and lasting solution, and an open cemetery that captures the bad reputation that haunts the US in the region and helps everyone who bears the banner of this cause to occupy a prestigious position on the world stage in the event that an agreement is reached. A better diplomatic approach than the one adopted by the US, and anyone who claims to be a great power or seeks to become a great power cannot turn a blind eye to it, but must take an explicit position on it. Since Barack Obama assumed power, the US has neglected the issue of Palestine in the Middle East, making it a secondary file, focusing its attention on the Indo-Pacific region, which constitutes the sphere of influence of its Chinese rival. This position prompted some of its historical partners, such as Saudi Arabia, to head east, especially since the East had already begun years ago to engage in trade and enter its markets. Such an approach undoubtedly reduces these countries' dependence on the US and diversifies their strategic partners without abandoning their traditional alliance with Washington. This multiple bias reflects the actors' increasing fear of the American partner, which is losing its credibility day by day. Strategically, it grew further in 2023 when the BRICS group opened its doors to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Iran. The group's expansion has strengthened the ambitions and support of the Russians and Chinese in the region, and this confirms that the shift in the balance of power that these countries hope for will inevitably take place in the Middle East. The strategy adopted by Washington after October 7th shows its inability to understand the changes that occurred 20 years ago, which affected not only the region but the entire world. Despite the strong condemnation of the policy of double standards, Joe Biden continues to adopt it by adhering to the traditional American position of absolute support for Israel's right to defend itself. This contradiction is clearly evident in Washington's harsh condemnation of Russia's accusation of committing war crimes in Ukraine, even though the horror of the crimes committed by the Israelis in Gaza far exceeds what's happening in Ukraine. While Ukraine represents a magnifying mirror of American double standards and exacerbates their inability to justify them, the horror of the crimes committed by the Israelis in Gaza exposes this double standard once again, even more than before. The US also continues its strategy through its systematic policy of obstructing the intervention of multilateral institutions in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, despite widespread criticism it has received by using its veto power at the Security Council against a draft resolution calling for a ceasefire and fueling its practice. This veto is more antagonizing the countries of the global south, which see the US as a spoiler of multilateralism to undermine the role of international institutions, when the latter attempt to place a US ally in front of a duty to comply with international humanitarian law. Joe Biden described the Palestinian resistance as absolute evil, then recalled America's role and described it as a beacon of the world and the indispensable nation. At a time when ideological backgrounds no longer dictate to their owners the form of alliances or the global order, this reference to the alleged American ideological and moral superiority, repeated for the 1,000th time, proves that the US administration's continued reliance to this day on an analytical spreadsheet about the world is outdated. Decision makers in the countries of the global south have always found Americans' moral claims extremely abhorrent, and Washington's highlighting of them is nothing but a revival of America's arrogant and impotent image, and proof of its failure to take the readings and visions of these actors into account when formulating its foreign policy. The Gaza war, with its extreme brutality and its comparison with what's happening in Ukraine, can expose the great American hypocrisy to public opinion in the countries of the global south. For several years, China has begun to extend its authority over the Middle East, especially through developing the New Silk Road project and building several strategic partnerships. It's taken the Middle East and the Palestinian issue as a starting point and a motivational factor to enable it to extend its influence on a global scale, taking advantage of the poor reputation of the US and the decline of its influence in the region. By exceptionally orchestrating the unexpected reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China's proven itself worthy of being more than just a commercial giant. When it entered into direct competition with the Americans, China demonstrated to regional and global actors its ability to be a reliable diplomatic alternative that's more attractive than the US. But to this day, it still deals cautiously with the Palestinian-Israeli issue and has not yet put forward any serious initiative aimed at achieving peace and justice in the region that matches its global diplomatic ambitions. It has more than once hosted Palestinian factions in order to build internal unity and end the internal Palestinian division. In any case, the flood of October 7th is currently taking place in its favor, and things will continue in this direction unless the US achieves a prominent diplomatic achievement in this issue, such as reaching a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of the Israelis from Gaza, or the resumption of peace negotiations. Russia today appears to be one of the main beneficiaries of the ongoing war. Since October 7th, all attention, and perhaps some military supplies as well, have been turned away from Ukraine and focused on Gaza and Israel, which has opened the way for an unexpected outlet for Moscow, whose leadership of a bloc considered anti-Western provides the opportunity for it to exploit the US's bad reputation in the region. With its rhetoric in support of Palestine and opposed to the West, it attracts Arab and Islamic public opinion and the countries of the global South in general, which reduces their isolation and enhances their soft power at the regional and global levels. Russia hopes to appear as an alternative leader to Washington in the Palestinian-Israeli issue, especially by adopting multilateral diplomatic activity that's consistent with its rhetoric that praises the arrival of the multipolar world, a hope reinforced by the gradual American withdrawal from the region. However, the security responded to two proposals submitted by Moscow for a ceasefire, even without the US having to use its veto. October 7th demonstrated once again the centrality of the Palestinian issue among other global issues, which led to the US being called upon to once again play the role of policeman in a region from which it had begun its withdrawal, and in an issue on which it had bet on silence, thanks to the normalization of relations between Israel and an increasing number of Arab countries in particular. This war comes in a global context in which the balance of power is shifting and in which the opposition of a group of non-Western countries, especially China and Russia, to the existing liberal international order is increasing. These two countries take the Middle East as a starting point from which to engage in their struggle for influence and with the aim of extending their control over other parts of the world. The longer the war between the Palestinian resistance and Israel lasts, the more the credibility of the US and the West in general in the countries of the global South will be shaken, as the future of the global order depends in part on the ability of the US to find a solution to this crisis, provided that it is not a short-term solution limited to stopping military operations. Not only that, it should be a long-term political solution. So that was the speech from Fawad Bakr of the DFLP, read by me. Very sorry for the technical issues that prevented Fawad from participating directly in this webinar. So as I said, we've got to the 2-hour mark now. I'm just going to ask the panelists in the order in which they spoke if they want to come in very quickly for sort of 2 to 3 minutes maximum on what each other have said or what's appeared in the chat or anything else that has occurred to them in the intervening periods. So starting with Sarah Flounders. Sarah, are you able to come in?
Yeah. First of all, the talks were today incredible, and I really can't wait for the video and the transcript because very valuable and very unique. I want to just put forward a little suggestion in terms of action in this moment. Now, Netanyahu is scheduled to speak to the US Congress on July 24th. And this is a moment when the whole movement should begin planning, considering strategies on mass actions, shutdowns, sit-ins, walkouts, traffic blocks, work stoppages, stayaways, general strikes, every kind of action in every city in the US and internationally to denounce Netanyahu's welcoming and speaking. It's an event designed to normalize and embrace genocide. So I think we need to look at it, encourage every group to think about what you can do collectively, how you could spread the word on this, how you could engage it, because ideas are infectious. And let's think about what we can do collectively to break ranks with the genocidal established order. Netanyahu is charged as a war criminal by the International Criminal Court, and we should demand he be arrested, not honored by his criminal collaborators. Now, there are local forces who are organizing a huge outpouring at the US Congress. We hope that'll be as large as possible, but it's a moment when much more is possible. And Organizations, large and small, national forces, community groups, religious groups, autonomous groups should begin to make, I think, creative and mass plans to represent the solidarity of millions of people. And so I want to just suggest we plant this idea, think about it, and move forward in solidarity. I know this has little to do with our discussions today, but really we're all in such incredible harmony and making very unique contributions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and very important note to end on. I believe Professor Morandi has had to leave the meeting, so Ramzi Barud, are you able to come in?
Can you hear me okay? All right, great. Very quickly, just would like to thank you all so very much. Lots to think about, and the struggle is not going to be easy in terms of our ability to create this kind of mutual platform that would bring us together from all of our backgrounds and ideologies, even, and and various backgrounds, in order for us to push for one single unified anti-imperialist agenda. Just want to finish with a quote or a phrase by Antonio Gramsci, the anti-fascist socialist intellectual of Italy, from which I speak right now. Gramsci has spoke about a period in history where he said that period is defined when the old refuses to die and the young is yet to be born. This is when terrible things happen. This is when we live in that age of monsters. And I think we live in that age of monsters. Netanyahu, Gallant, Biden, Trump, all the rest. These are the monsters of this age. But the positive thing about this age, it's an age of transition. In order for us to allow the young to be born, we have to work together. We have to put it all on the line, because this is, as has been stated over and over in this webinar, this is that time in history, this opportunity that comes only every 100 years. In order for this change to actually happen, to be sealed in, to become permanent. Imperialism has never been as scared as it is right now. We have never been as powerful and unified as we are right now. This is not the age of postponing anything, of overthinking anything, but rather moving forward, because there are millions of lives at stake, but also there are numerous opportunities for a period past this period where the young is finally born and a new possibility of a better world is also finally born. Thanks for listening to us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ramzi. I'm just checking from the chat. I'm not sure if Professor Mohammed Malandi is here after all. Ah, he is. Yeah, okay.
I am here.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I circulated the link incorrectly, so you've come up with my name. I'll change that for you, but please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really don't have a great deal to add. The excellent and on all the major issues. In fact, I think the point made about Netanyahu's speech in Congress is an important one. It's an opportunity for all of us who support resistance, all of us who are part of this broader resistance, to come together and actually bring about an opportunity for greater awareness, not only about the resistance itself, but about one another. When, as I was saying earlier, if we are able to create greater understanding during this unique period in time between the West, between people in Western countries and the global South, and people in the different parts of the global South, then I think this is itself a huge achievement. And the liberation of Palestine can bring about more than just the liberation of the people of Palestine, but it can bring about an intellectual liberation and a greater decolonization of the mind, something which all of the panelists touched upon, and something that I think needs to be pursued further. And perhaps this speech in the United States will be an opportunity to further that.
Thank you very much, Professor Morandi. A very absolutely crucial and inspiring point. Bikram, are you able to come in for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, just I think one point really quickly was I noticed in the chat there was a debate on China, like its significance in what's happening with Palestine. I think what I would really encourage people who have those questions or concerns is to really think about things in and like take a step back and take a mature, kind of sober, holistic approach, because on balance, it's very clear that China is of greater significance to the axis of resistance than it is to Israel. Like, so, to say, because it's trading with Israel, you can have criticisms, you can say it should do more, but if you look at on balance, I think it's very clear. And even when it comes to the point around military technology, like that China has had cooperation with Iran, it's helped Iran access technologies actually that it wouldn't have access to otherwise, potentially even from Israel, helping it reverse engineer drones and so forth, which has been really key to the rise of the Axis. And then, the Iran weapons corridor going through to Syria and Lebanon, and arming and backing the Palestinian groups is more pivotal even than the BDS movement in many ways, right? So I think that has to be kept in mind. Look at it on a balance. What's happening? I would say something happens yesterday. I think this picks up on some stuff Sarah was saying in her remarks. But yesterday in Shujaia, we're seeing massive invasion and attack that the Zionists are conducting there, and in Rafah. But we're still seeing the Palestinian resistance actually ambushing and engaging them in direct battle. And this is I think demonstrating again that there's these two wars happening, that the Zionists and the imperialists are attacking the unarmed, but when it actually comes to battle, it is being demonstrated that the impunity of Zionism and imperialism is a thing of the past, that there is always a confrontation, and at the military level, battles are going the other way. And I think this is a sign of what is to come, and the irrationality, again, of Zionism and imperialism today. Each action it does actually undermines its interest, right? It will never be able to defeat the resistance, whether in Yemen, in Lebanon, or in Gaza, because the resistance over a period of decades has had to learn and grow how to build its weapons, how to store its weapons, how to fight in such a way that they cannot be attacked. So I think that's one point I just wanted to emphasize again. I think Shujaia yesterday captures everything happening right now. And then I agree. The tragedy of Palestine and of the imperialist order has been how they're able to inflict violence with impunity. So here we have to continue working to raise the costs of their wars. What can we do to tilt the balance the other way, whether that's Netanyahu coming in July or just not refusing to normalize what's happening right now everywhere you are, right? Do not get tired. Keep pushing on each front. It is starting to crack, even if it feels like a little bit. And please consider visiting Gaza funds, whether on social media or on the website, and please donate and share as much as you can to those in Gaza who are looking to either find safety or find some way to survive this madness. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bikram. And finally, Keith, are you able to come in for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. And what I really want to say is thank you to all the other speakers that have made such wonderful points and collectively have made what I think has been a really excellent webinar that's raised so many points, provided so much food for thought, and has given us all such excellent information and analysis. I think in organizing this webinar, we sought to place it in an international, in a global context. And I think that's that's really important, because one of the sort of simple points of dialectics is that the whole is reflected in the part. Gaza is a very small place. It's a very small territory. It has a very small population, and yet what is happening in Gaza is changing the entire world situation. This small territory with a poorly armed couple of million people facing such an onslaught, and yet they are not only changing the face of Gaza and of the immediate region, but the entire world. They are as I indicated, as I mentioned, landing US imperialism and its closest followers in an unprecedented degree of isolation. And this is something that has built up quantitatively and has assumed qualitative form as countries and peoples around the world looked at the devastation that imperialism has brought over the last few decades, in particular since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the people have looked at the destruction of Iraq, Afghanistan, of Somalia, of Syria, of Libya, and of Yugoslavia, and so on. And then the United States turned around and demanded that the global South join them all in sanctioning Russia because of the Ukraine situation. And the global South, almost to a man and a woman, said no to that. And that was the first shock. And the second shock has been the utter condemnation of Israel and the United States by the overwhelming majority of countries and governments in the global South, but also of the peoples in the global North, who are coming in to struggle in a way that we haven't seen since half a century ago with the Vietnam War, with the courageous students in the United States. And of course, comparisons are made in Britain with the up to 2 million people who demonstrated against the Iraq War at the beginning of this century. But what we've seen is that for around 9 months, hundreds of thousands of people in Britain, and not just in London, but even in small towns and villages, have demonstrated not once, but again and again, week after week after week, in huge numbers. And something that is having its impact even, for example, in the general election campaign in Britain. So these are the enormous changes that the people of Gaza and the Palestinian resistance are bringing about throughout the world. And that's why we put this meeting in this global context. And by referring, as I just have, to the student protests in the United States, to the demonstrations in Britain, I, of course, just want to underline the point that Sarah made, that the point of this webinar is for people to understand, in order not just to interpret the world, but, as Mark said, to change it by doing whatever we can in our own situations to further the cause of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. An excellent note to end on. And overall, I think it's been a really important, a really interesting event. Sorry for any, the various technical issues and deficiencies, but we've had some wonderful contributions and a lot of ideas to think seriously about. And we're at a very special moment in history where we've got a unique opportunity to develop a global united front against imperialism, and we've all got a role to play in that. Those of us in the West in particular have got to finally play our part in that process. We've got to reject alliance with our own ruling classes and embrace the peoples of the global South, and oppressed groups, oppressed nations, oppressed classes. And we need to break the cultural hegemony of the imperialists. We need to reject Zionist propaganda. We need to reject anti-China propaganda, anti-Russia propaganda, anti-Iran propaganda. We need to reject the new Cold War. We need to reject NATO. We need to demand an end to NATO. We need to join hands for a multipolar world and keep fighting for a free Palestine. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Thank you on behalf of Friends of Socialist China. Thanks on behalf of the International Manifesto Group. We hope to see you again, to keep working with you and to keep building to a better future. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.